Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the live conversation about domestic stress and, of course, practical tools that can help us to cope with this domestic stress. I am Dr. Terry Curran-Reid, and it is a pleasure to serve you in the capacity as moderator for this afternoon. This forum, this very important forum and discussion, is brought to you by the University of the West Indies Open Campus in collaboration with my very good friends down there in Grenada, Go Blue Inc. I would also like to take the opportunity to give a shout out to Heron and Women and Development Unit of the University of the West Indies Open Campus for really putting this discussion together. So domestic stress is a huge topic. It's a massive umbrella with many touch points, effects, and manifestations, depending on who you are, your gender, your age, your status, socioeconomic stability or lack thereof, or even your literacy. There's so many people that are affected in their households every single day because of domestic stress. And we understand that that has been amplified because of COVID-19. We are blessed to have an amazing set of presenters this afternoon who are thought leaders in their spaces, in their fields of study, who are really here to break down these areas that we really see affected and to offer some insight and some enlightenment to assist us in managing here on out. For those of you who'd like to, to share this information and to share the link and to invite your other members and other friends of your network to be a part of the conversation, we encourage you to share the link and of course use the hashtag domestic stress, hashtag open UE campus, or hashtag one UE, ONE-UE. I look forward to this conversation, and we just want to remind you and of course to encourage you that as you continue to have conversations about domestic stress, please make sure that it is not limited to COVID-19, because that was just a stressor. That was something that amplified the conversation, but that this is so much bigger and it takes place in our islands, in our regions, and the world at large. So again, for those of you who are tuning in, thank you very, very much. And if you have your questions or concerns or maybe comments that you'd like to add, we ask that you save them for the end after all the presenters have presented their work and their insight. So again, thank you to the UE Open Campus for having this discussion. So I mentioned domestic stress on a couple of occasions. And so some of our viewers might be wondering, what is it? So it is, or it can be regarded as the way in which the home environment is affected by life events or events that threatens the well-being of individuals in that home, thereby making them unable to meet what we would look at as optimally expected of them. So in a very broad stroke, that is the definition of domestic stress. Again, our presenters are going to break it down, make it very granular, and they're going to speak to respective areas. And I cannot wait to hear the discussion. The first presenter who is up is Dr. Kai Morgan. Dr. Kai Morgan is a registered clinical psychologist in Jamaica with a PsyD in clinical psychology obtained from Carlos Albizu University, and she got that in September 2001. She worked as a clinical psychologist at the University of the West Indies as a lecturer and the University Hospital of the West Indies for 15 years as a consultant in the Department of Community Health and Psychiatry. She is currently the president of the Jamaican Psychological Society, and we do understand that the psychological effects of domestic stress is massive. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Kai Morgan to the virtual stage.
Greetings. Thank you. Thank you for the welcome. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, so as you indicated, I'm going to be talking to you about coping mainly with domestic stress. So I'm going to talk about stress in general, talk a little bit about domestic stress, and then really want to focus on the coping tools that we can use when we are experiencing domestic stress. So I think this picture just says it all, right? So I don't think I have to say very much more, right? That's your brain right there, right? And when we are under stress, there are all parts of our brains that are being squeezed right? And under pressure. So it's really important that we learn and we understand how we're gonna cope. And apart from of course, there are the social avenues, and there are other avenues within the resources that we have as a country, as a community, as a family that we utilize. And I'm focusing a little bit more on our individual resources that we need to psychologically cope, right? So when we're talking about stress in general, any kind of stress, we're talking about the psychological impact, right, that it has on us when our resources cannot, the abilities that we have we're not able to cope with the demands of whatever those stressors are, right? So they're too much. Basically, they're too much for us. We're unable to cope, right? And when we're unable to cope, it really is touching on the three parts that make up ourselves. We're talking about the biological, we talk about the psychological, and we talk about the social part. And the impact of stress and domestic stress is extremely broad and far-reaching, and it does touch on all these different mechanisms. The biological, right? So some people may have headaches, tummy aches, right? Things like that are indicators of stress. That feeds into the psychological, feeds into the biological, and the biological feeds into the psychological, right? So the experiences that you have, social also, these are all feeding into each other. So our interpersonal relationships can be affected, right? How we are able to work and function can be affected, right? So we have many different sources of stress. And the reality about stress is that it is constant, right? Meaning that generally in life, we don't get rid of stress in one area and then we focus on the next area. It's all going on, right, at the same time. So as you can see in this little image here, we have finances, we have the home, we have the social life, we have work, we have all of these different areas that stress us out. So we're focusing a little bit today on the home, all right, on the home and the family and those particular areas that create stress. But while that's happening, that individual is also dealing with those other pieces, is dealing with the stress of work, is dealing with financial stress, especially during COVID here, as we've been talking about and exploring. There are other sources of stress that have grown and increased as a result, right? So what we know, and we know about stress and coping with stress and about life in general, is that adaptability is the secret, right? It's something that is difficult for us as people. You know, we always say nobody don't like change, right? But at the same time, change is our secret to survival, right? So it's not, and as this very old quote that's coming from all the way from Darwin, it's not that the strongest of us survive, not that the most intelligent of us survives, but it's the ones that are most adaptable to change. So we think about that a lot in this time as we keep talking about and using these words, new normal and all of that. We have had to adapt, and those of us that have been able to adapt in more healthy, productive ways are the ones that are essentially, quote unquote, surviving, right? So we think about that concept. There is a little YouTube clip that I was going to play, but I think it's about 8 minutes long. So I think I'm going to leave it, and hopefully you can access it. It has been making its round on the social media pages, but I'll try to sum it up for you, that this is a conversation about how much this domestic stress has impacted us, because we are in spaces that are closer and closer and closer, and have been for longer periods of time that we're not accustomed to. So those of us that have been going through domestic stress would normally have the escape of work, right? The escape of school, right? For our children. So those have been moments that they get to kind of maybe take their breath, be able to regroup, be able to cope effectively. But now you're stuck, or you have been, depending on your situation, stuck in the same situation, unable to, quote unquote, escape, right? And figuring out, how do I now adapt? And so we have seen a rise in the rates or the reports or the discussions around domestic stress for this matter, which makes this webinar extremely important for us to have this discussion. right? So this is another infographic that I like to use around it. It's created around COVID and around the different motions that or the psychological feelings that we go through when we face something actually for the first time, and how we're dealing with it, right? So we start usually in the fear zone. And so when we think about COVID and we think about all the stressors that have come with it, that we start out in the fear zone typically, so you're complaining, maybe thinking about what is this thing, I have to go run to the supermarket, get some whole heap of food, and all the things, all the Lysol missing from the shelves, and all the different activities all the things we did in that initial phase were around the fear zone, right? And so I want you to think about where you are now as I go through these different zones, and think about what has been helpful to you as you have gone through this period. So we have the learning zone, where we start to kind of, okay, I can't control this, but I can control that. I can wear my mask, or I can wash my hands, I can use the Lysol, I can, these are the things I can do. And I focus on that, focus on the emotions, you identify what it is that you're feeling, maybe you stop rushing out to the supermarket every day because you think that, it's going to all be finished, or we're going to go on lockdown, or different things like that. You recognize that you're doing your best, and that's what we call the learning zone. And then we reach to the growth zone. And in the growth zone, we're thinking about others maybe, and how can we reach out to others that are less maybe fortunate, or not adjusting, not adapting as well as we may have, right? And we're looking at the present, we're focusing on the present, we're being more mindful, we're more empathic with ourselves, and with others, we are thanking, we're appreciating. And so that's what we call like the growth zone, right? So this, of course, is something that I want everybody to think about, and think about as well within the context of domestic stress, right? And what we have, our tools that we have that are available to us that we can utilize, and what tools that we can begin to understand or bring to the table for ourselves, right? So we think about those things. So here, just this little quote that I liked a lot, that life balance is giving proper priority and perspective to all aspects of your life to keep your life upright and steady, right? So balance also does not equal, it doesn't mean that all areas are necessarily equal, right? But that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing all the same things in the different areas at the same amount of time and attention, but it means that you recognize where there may be a gap here, and I may have to improve in this area, or do a little more in this area, do a little less in this area. And we all have that balancing act to work through every day, right? So when we think now more specifically about managing stress, these are some of the things. A lot of people use these things. And we think about stress management, a lot of these things are there that people utilize. Exercise, right? Yoga, nature. Now, some of these, if you remember, would have been compromised while we were more, for us certainly in Jamaica and in the Caribbean, more on lockdown. These were definitely more compromised. So we were not able maybe to go to the gym, or to go outside and jog or walk, to involve ourselves in nature, because some people need that. Some people need the beach, some people need the river, some people need the gardening, some people, so these things were a little bit compromised in some cases, but we were finding our way with the different activities that we have, and trying to figure out new ones that were more compatible with being inside, if you will. And there you see also therapy, right? So some people would have begun to access therapeutic services because of what had been happening and has been happening in terms of being able to cope, right? So when we think about all of those things, and we think about our personal wellness, we think about, these are so many areas that we need to, quote unquote, pay attention to when it comes to our wellness. So we have our social, our emotional, our occupational, our intellectual, the environment, our spiritual, our physical, and you'll see little ideas around what all those things are. But these are some of the areas that maybe we can take a look at this, and we can say, okay, you know what? I haven't been paying as much attention to my emotional. I haven't been paying as much attention to my spiritual, right? To the physical. And so as we begin to kind of think about the balance and think about how we're coping with what's going on in our lives, with the stress and the domestic stress in our lives, we can kind of take a picture of this and figure out, okay, what area do I need to pay attention to? Even if you say it for this week, right? This week, let me focus on the emotional, right? And we always have to figure out our self-care. The time is always going to be there, right? We can't create it, we can't destroy it, but it's how we use it, right? So we have to know, we have to accept that this is who we are, right? We have to be good to ourselves, right? And we have to know and understand what are our limitations, right? So within the context of domestic stress, you have to understand and forgive yourself and be good to yourself and take care of yourself, and knowing that this is what you can manage at this time, right? And what it is that you can manage and what you can't, right? Things that you can do, you can make you constantly self-aware. I think self-awareness is so important. Like, where am I at? You know, check in with yourself, check in with others. Where are you at? How are you feeling? Right? When you're looking at that infographic I just showed with the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone, check yourself on a daily basis if you want to. Where am I at today? Because that can be very fluid. It doesn't stay one place necessarily all the time, right? We always are talking about prioritizing and time management. Prioritizing is important. People that are usually involved in domestic stress and struggle with domestic stress have a hard time prioritizing themselves, right? And so it's usually about the other person and doing, and whether it's the children as well, or the family members as well, that you have to take a little time for yourself, because yourself, if without you, as I just mentioned, then there's nothing else that can come from that if you are not whole, if you are not feeling good, right? We know about SMART goals. We hear about those addressing or making a plan, even a little short-term plan that says, and as I said, it could be for the week right now, right? Because we're trying to stay in the present as well. We're trying to figure out, okay, what can I do today, right? Not even for the week, sometimes for the day, for the hour, right? What can I do? How can I shift my perspective? What is it that I'm thinking that is making me feel this way? And how can I shift that, right? And of course, social support. Social support is so critical. Social support is influential and impacts everything that we can think about. If I was to talk about chronic illnesses, non-communicable diseases, all of the rest of them, with social support, it is better. Everything is better with positive social support, right? So who you can reach out to, right? When do you need to step away from something, or not even deal with it right now, because you may have to leave it alone right now in that moment, right? So you have the relaxation. I encourage people to, all the time, there's so many, I'm sure you see them pop up sometimes on your phone. When you're using your phone, you'll see these little apps that are talking about, whether you see Calm is one that pops up for me a lot, which is a lot of things around trying to breathe and relax and keep the body calm, right? As it suggests. There's several other apps that are like that. There's several YouTube videos that you can find that if you like to hear the rain falling and it relaxes you, you like that sound of the waterfall, whatever it is, then you can access that, right? And be able to just, even if you have a little moment to do that, to do something that you like, even if it is you're going in the kitchen to cook, if you like that, right? What is your me time? And importantly, as I said earlier, with prioritizing, knowing when to say no and when to say yes, that is so important. It's just demands versus priorities, the demands of the family, the demands of the other persons, that may be a part and parcel of the domestic stress, that you have to be able to say yes and no, when to say that. Of course, we talked about exercise and being careful about thinking about too much into the future, too much wishful thinking, like, I wish that was me, or I wish that could happen, right? And too many statements like, oh, I must, I need to be, I have to be this kind of person, I should be, right? Putting a lot of pressure on yourself to perform and to do things that are just not within your capacity right now, you know. And I wanted to leave you with this very simple grounding technique, right? And when I say grounding, what it means is that sometimes we get lost in either the future or lost in the past, right? And when our mind, and I always tell people, your mind is not always your friend, right? Whoops, I broken up. Okay, right. The mind is not always your friend, and you have to recognize when the thoughts are coming that are negative, that are not productive, that at that point you have to kind of ground yourself, right? And remember what is in the present. And so this little simple exercise is also called the 5 senses exercise. And it really focuses on the 5 senses, as it states, and you're going to think about something that you see, right? So you choose something that you don't usually notice. So, oh, I noticed that crack on the wall. So because it focuses you on the present. And this is exactly what we want exercise to do. Focusing you on right here, because your thoughts of the future are creating a lot of anxiety for you. And your thoughts of the past are creating a lot of maybe sadness and depression and anxiety as well. So let's stay right here in the moment. And nothing keeps you in the moment like your senses, right? What are you feeling? Right? So maybe 5 things. It goes down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So you have 5 things that you can see. And as I said, we try to kind of focus on things that you don't usually notice. 4 things that you're feeling, right? Whether it is the chair that you're sitting on right now, the bed, the what is it that you're feeling, your clothes, right, on your body, those kinds of things that a lot of times we don't take notice of, right? So, and again, it's just grounding you in the present. Hearing, what are you hearing? 3 things that you may hear in the background. It just started to rain here. I heard that, right? Coming in. So we have that, the birds chirping, maybe some car pass by, traffic, etc. 2 things that maybe you can smell, right? And this one takes a little bit more focus. And 1 thing that you can taste. And that's a simple little exercise sometimes when you feel like you might be overwhelmed, losing a little bit of control maybe, that you can use to just in 5 minutes even to just kind of center yourself a little bit. Maybe you feel a little calmer. We make decisions best when we are in that zone. When we are out of control and we're overwhelmed, we do not make the best decisions, right? That's why we always are telling each other, just don't make any decision right now. When you're upset and you're all of that, calm down a little bit. And so this is a little exercise to help your body to just kind of calm down so that you can make a decision from there, right? So I hope that was helpful. I think you're going to feel questions at the end, right? So thanks. That's me.
Thank you so very much. I mean, if we were not in the virtual space, I totally would have asked everyone in the audience to kindly give Dr. Morgan a round of applause, and we can certainly do that even though it is virtual. Thank you so very much, because I understand that, speaking about the psychological effects it's a wide topic, it's a big topic, and for you to be able to summarize and to offer practical advice in such a short time, I mean, it really does go to show that you know your thing. For the persons who might be just joining, or for those who just want some takeaways, for me, just listening to you, you kind of taught us not to take things for granted. And even though we're thinking about the psychological, it doesn't just only affect the mental, but we need to understand that our biology is also affected, and our social behavior as we interact with other persons in our space is also affected. So it's almost like a 360 corporal effect. You spoke about it being constant. And so I think persons need to take it easy on themselves. No one is exempt. It doesn't matter how rich people are, no matter how rich people may look. The fact of the matter is that we all are experiencing stress in different ways, shapes, and forms. You mentioned that it is important for us to identify what those stressors are and to be honest. Be honest with ourselves. It's okay to process. Then it's really trying to figure out what we can control versus what we can't control. And after identifying that, adjusting and adapting. Finally, the biggest takeaways, other takeaways were, it is not selfish to take care of self, because sometimes we do not know when to say no. We do not know how to put our boundaries in place. And sometimes we take on more than we can chew. And finally, Balance is what we really try to achieve. And balance does not mean that we're going to take on everything equally, but that we will identify what is priority, keep them in perspective, and manage our time well. I hope I did your takeaways justice. Thank you so very much, Dr. Morgan. And again, we want to take the opportunity to remind our viewers, no matter where you're coming in, that you can jot down your questions right now, but we'll be taking those questions, those comments, those concerns at the end after all presentations. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Morgan. We move right along to our next presenter, Marsha Heinz, who is a human rights advocate with specialization in the rights of women and children, domestic violence, and its impact on child raising. She's currently the president of the National Organization of Women Barbados. Please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Marsha Heinz to the virtual stage. Is she with us? We're just checking. All right, unmute your mic. It gets everyone all the time.
I'm sorry.
All right, thank you.
I did, but I didn't hit it hard enough. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Good evening, rather. It's easy to follow Dr. Morgan because, as you said, she set out her stuff quite so. So it makes it easy for me to just tack on to her. And what I wanted to look at today, I wanted to look at the difference between stressors and dysfunction. Because as Dr. Morgan would have indicated,
Ms.
a
Heinz?
level of Can you hear me?
All right, I was just going to, you sound as if you're going in and out. I'm not too certain if your microphone is a little bit far from your, right. So we don't, okay.
I'm sorry.
Thank you
Let me
so
fix
very much.
that.
Sorry to interrupt, continue.
My apologies. Okay, so do you want me to just continue or do you want me to start again? Just continue? Okay, fine. So as I was saying, what I wanted to look at today, I wanted to give a little bit more of an explanation on the differences between stress and dysfunction. Because as Dr. Morgan would have indicated ably, stress is something that is a part of the life cycle. So we all go through stressful phases in our life. However, there's a point at which stress becomes something a bit more than that. And I thought it would be useful as well to empower our audience with some information. So stress can be managed with management, right? So you can have a strong support unit, and that can give you some resilience against stress. So if you have, for example, an aging parent, taking care of that aging parent presents some stress within the domestic space. And of course, we're defining the domestic space as where people live, where people cohabit. And so if you have a support unit then who comes together and makes a collective plan to take care of that elderly individual, that kind of is a stress management mechanism. Conversation is actually a distressor within the domestic space, right? So we're talking about stress management, positive, healthy conversation. And that is something, of course, that needs to be practiced because I think it's important to say that a lot of what we're putting on the table here or will put on the table during this discussion is not the Caribbean norm. And we have to accept that and we have to try to move to stronger ways of being. But conversation can act as a distressor. So that teenage son that you have that's going out at 11 o'clock, that presents some stress because you don't know where he's going, you don't know if he's safe. Having a conversation around his feelings, around your anxieties, that can act as a distressor. Counseling is a positive way to manage stress. Families go through, like we just said, all types of changes. A relative dies suddenly, a relative dies tragically. Sometimes to be able to manage events like that, we simply have to call in the professionals and be willing to sit with them. So what I just went through is kind of life events that cause stress. And I wanted to clearly juxtapose that now from dysfunction. So we're moving into the realm that I'm more known for, stress becoming dysfunction, which we call domestic violence. And we know that there are multiple types of that: elderly abuse, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, any kind of unrest between siblings, between familial relations. So dysfunction now is a bit different from stress. It is not just a one-off something that happens and causes upheaval in the family. And the first thing we have to do when managing dysfunction is to recognize the causes of it. We might be going into things now like issues of mental illness, mental wellness concerns. And if you're dealing with that, you simply must get additional support for the family. You can't wish it away. You can't pretend it away. Okay? We might be looking at substance abuse issues. Again, heavy lifting, things that we might not be able to manage on our own. We are looking, for example, at childhood um, baggage, for the lack of a better word, that individuals might be carrying, cycles that were learned that now have to be unlearned and changed around. And of course, the difference again between stress and dysfunction is that dysfunction will then create continuous conflict in the family. So if it is not addressed, it becomes exacerbated and the incidents of it become more, and individuals are more likely to be hurt. So I wanted to make a clear distinction because as Caribbean people, we are accustomed to grinning and bearing. We are accustomed to making the best of bad situations, right? And sometimes we are not very adept at seeing when stress becomes dysfunction. We have to address dysfunction. That's another thing that we have to do. And like I said, we have to be willing to lean on the professionals. That again is not a Caribbean norm because we like to keep inside business inside. But we have to change that and we have to create spaces where individuals are comfortable to reach out for help. And then, whereas with stress, we can manage ourselves through those periods using some of the techniques that this Dr. Morgan just spoke about. With dysfunction, we might start to have to look at things like exit strategies. So if we have a woman and she's involved in an intimate partner situation, there is physical violence, there's sexual violence, for example, you really can't manage that over a long term. So when you're looking at the realm of dysfunction, no, you're looking at exit strategies. You're looking at keeping people safe and making sure that individuals can step away from situations that they need to step away from. Of course, as well, I would say, in summing up that little part, we have to look at our culture. We have to be willing to recognize as Caribbean people that there are some elements of our culture which we simply need to re-engineer. The way that we see the roles of men, the way that we see the roles of women, the way that we view children as voiceless and rightsless. All of these are things that we have to talk about and seek conscious differences around if we are going to be able to manage realistically to turn our societies around. And of course, I'm talking about the global Caribbean, right? The global CARICOM region, because a lot of the issues that we are facing, we're not facing in Barbados and not in Trinidad. We're not facing in Trinidad and not in St. Lucia. So in real ways, what we need is to be able to think of the best practices. And as soon as we start to think about the best practices, I think that we have to accept that we don't have a lot of political will. These things that we're discussing here today are seen as the soft realm, the things that we talk about once and again in between the economics and in between the tourism. What we have to do is reshape the way that we think about domestic stress. And we have to understand that domestic stress is very much tied to a macroeconomic position and to all of these other fancy things that we talk about, because the reality is that we're talking about how people can be productive. A person gets up from a home environment on a daily basis and they go to work. And what they're able to contribute in that space is conditioned by the experiences that they have in that domestic space. Okay. Now, one of the other things I wanted to make a point on before I came off of the regional conversation is that we do have best practices. So, for example, in the Trinidad and Tobago space, they just created a new domestic violence unit, and it is an amalgamation of their police service. They've long since stopped with this police force thing since 1966, actually, same year that Barbados became independent. They went to a police service. And now a flagship in that police service is that they have a domestic violence unit that is manned jointly by police and civilian staff. So the experience of a woman leaving domestic dysfunction is very different and a lot more supportive And if we're talking about the regional response, then we have to flag that as a best case. I also have to say that our leadership at all levels must give us um, positive role modeling. So, I don't want to turn this space into a controversial one, but it is we just have to make sure that our leadership in all spheres um, is supportive, and that the political will that we want to see and the treatment of women and the role models of the treatment of women at all levels from CARICOM back down are the ones that we are preaching to the man in the street. I think I'll leave it there. The final thing that I wanted to say, and I started on it under the regional discussion, is that our perception of domestic stress must change. So this is not an issue of the man and the woman in the family, or the woman without the man in the family, or the man who hates women in the family. This is really a state problem. It affects productivity. It affects the type of future citizens that we raise, both boys and girls, because we're modeling the behavior to them of how the future family is supposed to look. So, really and truly, when we sit down to talk about things like domestic stress and domestic dysfunction, this is one of the most important conversations that we can have as a region. In terms of solutions, I think we need to educate Caribbean people about the type of family structure that we have now. Not to say necessarily that the family structure is not a positive one, but I think we have to be able to articulate what it is that is positive about it. We have to be able to articulate how we can make it stronger. And then we have to articulate the gap in between what we have, what can make it stronger, and where we want to take it. So I'm not necessarily premiuming any particular type of family look. A stable family, a wholesome and healthy family is what I'm premiuming. However, we get there, we get there. But we have to have the discussion, and the discussion must be steeped in history. We must accept and realize that a lot of what we do in families right now, we've taken straight off the plantations across these regions. And obviously, that is not the model, I humbly submit, that we want to keep replicating. So not only must we educate people, but we must educate people in a way that is historically accurate so that we can make the decisions that we need to make. We need to do some re-engineering, like I said before. There are things that we have to accept don't work. Okay. So the fact that many Caribbean women report their first instance of being sexual to be forced, and to be forced from a family member, or to be forced from a trusted adult male. These are things that we have to start to talk about. And again, that's not a Barbadian problem. It's not a Trinidadian problem. That is a CARICOM problem. Okay. So how do we start to have these discussions? How do we start to re-engineer? Because when we're talking about the way that stress begins and the way that people become susceptible to continuous cycles of abuse, it starts with those stressful activities, and it starts with those individuals not being able to find ways out and simply perpetuating, dysfunction over and again. Two final things: we have to fix social support systems. Like I said, Trinidad has just done something very exciting and very different with their response to intimate partner violence. A lot of us, as other islands, have a long way to go. So Barbados and our social services that need dismantling and reconstructing. St. Lucia, I know, has some of the same issues. I know that Grenada has spent a lot of time restructuring their response, for example, to juvenile justice. So we have to be able to recognize that support in these social services is important, and make sure that we fix our models. And like I said, we do have some best practices among us. And the final thing that I think we have to do is that we have to break generational cycles. There are things that are happening in the Caribbean over and over and over and over. And in a lot of ways, for a lot of families, we haven't moved past the 1930s look and feel of what we were doing in those families. And so the way that people are able to show up in their lives, like I said, in their work, you know, this idea that Dr. Morgan put down of being an optimal person we have a lot of Caribbean people who do not reach their optimal potential because of what they face. So that's just my little addition. I think it's a very useful discussion and one that we definitely have to have more of going forward.
Thank you so very much, Marsha Heinz. You dropped quite a lot of gems, really, and it's unfortunate that we have to have this conversation about domestic abuse and violence when, of course, stresses, as you rightfully say, they no longer become one-offs, but rather it becomes chronic. It becomes constant to the point where people's lives, children's lives are now in danger. And as she was speaking, what I kept on writing on my page is culture. At the end of the day, a huge chunk of why we're not able to really make the leaps that we need to is because of culture and socialization and the false belief and the false narrative that it's a part of the culture, it's a part of the society. We're born and see it like this, we're going dead and see it like this, and that there's nothing we can do. And a part of that culture and socialization is people feeling shame. There is shame when victims want to come forward, but they are afraid that they will be re-victimized and how they may look. They may look weak. And a part of that culture tells us that we need to be ride or dies. We must stay, grin, bear it, fight it. And if we're not loyal to the end, then our value, we are of no value. And I think all of those languages and what we teach each other becomes a conditioning. And it is not isolated, as Marsha Heinz said, because for those of us who may say that that does not affect us, it becomes generational. And those persons who come up as children now become citizens. And the question is, what type of citizens do they become? So just to my biggest takeaway is that we need to be honest. We need to have conversations that are honest, that are open, and that we confront it. It may not be comfortable, but we need to get past the discomfort to really start having real change. And where the leadership is concerned, Marsha, I understand that you don't want to be controversial. I can be a little bit, but certainly leaders, and we must hold them accountable. If they're not good role models where this movement is concerned, then they must be removed. Point blank, period. So thank you very much, Marsha Heinz, for sharing that with us and for unpacking so much reality that we experience in our islands and across the region. So we move from Marsha Heinz and we move into Untitled Heron, who I know personally, and we always go back and forth on Twitter. Now, Untitled Heron is a slasher, development specialist, workshop facilitator, human rights advocate, and performance poet. A graduate of UWI and Cambridge University, Taitu is a long-standing social justice activist whose work in program management, policy development, and research focuses on the intersectional dynamics of citizenship and the rights of children, women, and LGBTQ people in Caribbean development. She's currently the head of the Women and Development Unit 1 of the UWI Open Campus. Definitely an activist, definitely an advocate. Ladies and gentlemen, kindly welcome Untitled Heron to our virtual stage.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Terry. Thank you so much, everyone who has spoken so far. Kai and Marsha, really appreciated hearing what you had to say before. It dovetails, what I'm going to speak about dovetails perfectly. My conversation or my contribution to the conversation is really about childcare and where childcare fits in the economy. And the extent to which how the two issues that both Kai and Marsha raised can add to a certain amount of stress and dysfunction when our economies are not designed to take childcare under a greater consideration. And one of the things we have seen is how COVID-19 has upended what childcare is really about. We know that, to get it under control, governments had to be stringent, and at least in the Caribbean, we can see that that stringency was quite was fairly good. It had to bring COVID-19, the pandemic, under control in order to protect families, business, and so on. And with the restricted gatherings, movements, everything, closing of schools, kindergartens, preschools, daycare, and mandating home-based work as well. And we also saw that there are quite a few persons who would have lost work, whose livelihood would have been affected, particularly, for instance, those who like in different types of occupations, would have had a very gendered impact in terms of how it affected them. It affected male-dominated spheres such as fisheries. It would have affected construction more. It would have affected seamstresses in a different way. So, and anywhere you have persons who are responsible for caring children, COVID completely upended what that looks like. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that there's a way in which COVID exacerbated some of the weaknesses in the relationship between where childcare is situated, where work is situated, and how the economy functions. I'll just give you, quickly to say that prior to COVID, we didn't, and this is not just and this I think it varies according to levels, but we would be able to say fairly that there is a lack of sufficient care options for the elderly, for persons with disabilities, as well as children. And the care functions, because it fits within a capitalist framework, has fallen more heavily on women than men. And this has shifted somewhat as time has gone, but because the economy is considered public and what happens in the domestic sphere is considered private, and women were traditionally seen only to operate in the private sphere, not in the public, care work still falls disproportionately on women. And this, of course, would negatively impact the kind of hours that they spend in income generating activities, whether or not they are formally employed. So you would find that this is across the region, low labor force participation, high employment rates among women rather than men, and women own less businesses than their male counterparts. So there's an extent to which even before COVID, the creative and the full capacity of women's contribution to an economy was underutilized, while men's capacity to participate more fully in the nourishment and growth of their children, we would say would have required or does require strengthening. And to go back to the point that Marsha had raised, there's not a welcoming culture in a sense to have a structure that allows for kind of a concurrent institutional strengthening that puts childcare, centralizes childcare in the economy and in the workplace, so to speak, so that both men and women can participate far more fully in the economic sphere, and more equitably so, for men to participate more fully in the domestic sphere and for women to participate more fully in the economic sphere. And then here comes COVID. Everything just mashed up. Everything got not mashed up, but kind of got upended. So if we had those kinds of problems before, it got exacerbated. And things are now moving into the direction where we're thinking about, some persons have gone back to working in the office while some people still have home-based care. We know that schools still haven't reopened, or not all schools have reopened. We know that kindergarten and nurses and so on are not going to reopen anytime soon. So there is really a parallel crisis of what happens to children during this time that I think has not been given due consideration. And part of that challenge I think we have to really pay attention to is how do we address that without assuming, and which is what I'm seeing happening because it's something that I've been paying attention to, without assuming the idea that childcare is a private issue. And because childcare is not private in the sense of measuring production, one of the things that we have to grapple with is how an economy is measured, right? And one of the things that is considered, for instance, if you're not formally employed, the work that you're doing is not considered productive work. So somebody who has a business from her home and she's taking care of her children also from her home, she's not considered to be engaged in productive employment or productive work. Or it's not taking care of children at home is not considered productive work. So there's a devaluing then of taking care of children. and the consideration of children as citizens are not necessarily considered important insofar as they're not, their citizenship then is not considered as that important until they become adults, because while they are children, they're considered the future labor force. And we have to really reassess and re-examine when we only think of children as the future labor force. So therefore, even though the landscape has changed somewhat in terms over the years, the structuring of the economy has not. So it still operates under the assumption that we will figure out this basic thing, that what happens in the private sphere, as in childcare, will be sorted out privately. And it has a lot of gendered implications, because as you can see from what has been happening with COVID, even before going in, care work is disproportionately affects women more than men. And in another instance, in another sense as well, even while we're here under COVID, even that arrangement has been significantly upended depending on the kind of livelihoods that men and women occupy, and how that would have shifted under COVID, where some men would have now had to begin to play more stronger roles in the domestic sphere and, you know, supporting their partners more and more. And vice versa. So it's really, the challenge with it as well is that we don't have data because it is ongoing, right? And that would be one of my recommendations, that we do need baseline data at some point to be able to chart our way forward and resolve this, what I see as a parallel crisis of childcare, and how it has to be really properly integrated into a functioning economy that sees children as human beings in full capacity, and not just a future labor force. So you will, it's a situation where mothering and fathers workers and their mothering and fathering workers, and I like that phrase, this comes from a colleague of mine, Gabriel Hussein, in Trinidad, and their employers now find themselves in this really ever-changing work and care landscape that is really tricky to navigate without any policy guidance. The kind of childcare protocols and institutional arrangements that existed before COVID have to be reassessed. It's not something that we can really rely and depend on now. So it's, to me, one of the things we really have to work through is, as employers, for instance, whether it's government, whether it's private sector, is to look at what the childcare protocols are now, and depending on the circumstance, directives might stipulate closing facilities, but offering, you may have to think through about how can you offer limited childcare services to select group of families, for instance, essential workers. Leaving essential workers without childcare options is going to be quite detrimental. And again, that has gendered impacts, because, you know, you find more women working in essential care than you do men. I think that one of the things we have to also think through is the lines of communication with employees at this time. It has to be very, very crucial, and we have to understand the kind of requirements, or to work through the kind of requirements and actions that need to be taken to ensure that not only that livelihoods can resume, you know, according to the protocols, and that persons who weren't working can come back into the workplace, but it is going to be very difficult to think about employees wanting to return or continue to work in a work environment where they're not sure, cannot guarantee the well-being of their children. So to operate under the assumption that parents, you have parents who adults are supposed to parent without working, as if they don't work, and then work as if they don't parent. It is quite a dilemma that I think we have not really thought through in a very structural and strategic way, because I don't think, you know, most governments and technocrats and so on are very busy in managing COVID and managing all the implications across sectors, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's government, tourism and so on, that the basic issues of how we manage households and how we manage children is not part of the issue, has not come back, is not front and center on an agenda for on an agenda for development. And it has to be, Yeah, we can't continue with the idea that what happens in the domestic sphere is to be relegated to a secondary place because the economy is more important. You know, we can't have an economy functioning without adults and children who are not well, who are stressed. And so I think that to me is one of the things we really have to think through, that it has to be a far more holistic situation in terms of how we get ourselves beyond it. None of my recommendations are going to be practical. Mine are all policy oriented and programmatically oriented. What I do recommend, however, is that we have to be able to be in the government and private sector has to be in a position where we think about providing childcare services to essential workers, allowing for home-based work where it is possible, and allowing for flexible work options even during home-based work, and to allow, where possible, staff to take paid leave. That one is a little tricky because we know that the financial situation in a lot of organizations and private sector companies, it's dicey. We don't even know if people can afford to give leave. But I do think that my point generally right now is that it is absolutely important for us to have the conversation, the discourse, the town hall meetings, even if it's virtual, right, or small meetings, the conversation about the structure of the economy and where children fit and where care work fits has to be had. I think one of the things that the coronavirus has brought with us is what we are witnessing. Yeah, and the kind of, it has brought up every single possible inequality, every single possible discriminatory practice that is also rooted in our history, every single possible cultural behaviors that has not served us well. It has brought up how tourism dependent we are and how bad that has been. It has brought up a whole set of dysfunctions that we have not attended to in terms of services. And I think it is not only calling us to witness these things, it is also calling us to pay attention and to change it. So for me, when we're thinking about childcare, it presents us with an opportunity to really centralize children and the value of children in a society, in economy, in development, because we have to think about what kind of development or what kind of society we want to see when they become adults. We can't just think about children as, you know, that song goes, I believe the children are our future. No, the children are here right now. So if our societies are not thinking through the idea of structuring the economy where children themselves are centralized, we will not have properly functioning adults. We will not have adults who are expressing their full potential or being as productive citizens as we would like them to be. So to me, we have to start being more proactive citizens in getting our governments, our technocrats, our policymakers, or lawyers, human rights advocates, and so on, even, you know, those within university and so on. So for instance, even not within a UE, you know, not all campuses have childcare offerings, you know. So what do, you know, those kinds of situations, what do people do? So to me, it can start at various levels, at the institutional level, but I genuinely believe that we have to really start having the conversation. This is not a situation where, you know, we must just go on and take it because this is how it has always been. I can generally believe, I really believe that COVID is here for many reasons, and it is calling us to change a lot of things in our society. And if we don't pay attention to what it is being called to witness and change, we're going to really suffer in the long run, and even more domestic stress. And lastly, I will say, children really should not be subjected to domestic stress. They have a right to shine the light because that is what they bring for us, and that is what they have to share with us all. I'll end it there. Thank you.
Right. hear me? This is an audio test. This is an audio test. Can you see? Can anyone hear me? Can anyone see me?
Now you're visible and audible.
Okay, all right. So good. Good afternoon again, everyone. I do apologize for that. They say that Murphy has a way of showing up. That's exactly what he did. We are experiencing rain in the Barbican area. Therefore, my electricity, we just experienced a power cut, hence the breakdown on my side. I do apologize. I'm not too certain if I've missed anything, but I'd certainly like to thank Taitu for her presentation. Mr. Her speak almost echoes that of Marsha Heinz in terms of the different cultural aspects that we have. The micro level, the caring for the responsibility falls on just women. So disproportionately, women are in charge. And then from the macro level, we just don't see as leadership really regarding children and their rights, their human rights, their basic human rights. And we stop looking at them in the future and start looking at them as the present and how we can help to build them. I mean, I'm not certain. I get to a location, but everywhere is dark because of the power cuts. So I am not certain. Someone else is the rain that is affecting me. That will give me. Thank you. I certainly hope I have not caused any interruption. We have one more presenter, and then we move into the questions and the answer segment. We welcome Jamie Pottinger to the virtual stage. A driven educator, Mr. Pottinger currently serves the Forest Lake a leadership and consulting practice that specializes in leadership training and development. Jamie Pottinger, we welcome you to the virtual stage.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's really great for us to have this kind of conversation, one that I think is overdue, but I'll get right into it. As I was introduced, Jamie Pottinger here. I think what I'll be addressing here is talking about our children in the home and the level of abuse that they encounter as a result of what we're facing now, not as a result of what we're facing, but as an impact of the COVID-19 and people being restricted. I think what COVID-19 has pointed to us quite clearly is a dark part of our history, that which we have inherited from the founding fathers of the slave ship and what happened on the plantation. And as a result of that, we have been whitewashed moving forward, having us think that we have a strong system. But now that we're facing where we have parents being at home, we're seeing more cases of abuse and stuff of that sort. And we're wondering where that's coming from. And we have in our culture whereby we're fearful of accepting that all our children, even ourselves, we have at-risk tendencies. And at-risk tendencies mean that we are always at the brink or the verge, or we all have a breaking point in case something happens. And what COVID-19 has done for us is that because we're all in the same space consistently, we're forced to be who we are based on our challenges. in the Caribbean, I know, as someone who grew up in the Caribbean, I know that when it comes down to certain emotional and behavioral disorders, it was something that was frowned upon if you were stated as having any of those areas, because it's as if it's a crime to be labeled with a behavioral or emotional disorder. But what I'll start out by saying here is that we all have at-risk tendencies, and the at-risk tendencies, we find them manifesting when we have situations like COVID-19. And the next thing is that we have parents who are not really in the home as frequently as they should be. So they have little or no knowledge of some of the strengths, weaknesses, or challenges of their children. So now what happens is that when parents are without jobs, or even if they're with jobs and they're in the home setting, they now have to confront their kids in terms of trying to find ways to correct certain behavioral patterns that were always there. And because maybe finances or the economics have changed, what you find happening, some of the things that would be soothing for a child is no longer there. So the child start acting out. And based on the child acting out, then we have our parents who seek to use certain measures to contain the behavioral practice, which may end up being abusive. Now, when we look at these things, there are a few things that comes to mind. We talk about inherited tendencies, we talk about cultivated tendencies, and we talk about motivated tendencies. There are certain things that we would have passed on to our children, which, because we're not in their presence on a frequent basis, we're not able to see exactly what are the challenging points that they have. Now, we talk about cultivated tendencies. We talk about the culture and what the cultures afford them to be exposed to, whether school, the music, you name the different things. And these tendencies allow our children to be in a position where they're needing of help. But because they're in the school setting and they're not at home, we are not able to see exactly what some of the challenges that they're facing. Now, because we're seeing it at home, we now think that it's our responsibility to get it out of them, whether we're using a beating, a flogging, or punishment. And some of these punishments that we're giving are borderlining on abuse, or maybe, yes, rightfully so, maybe on abuse. And what this is doing is creating a more damaging situation or scarring situation for children, which puts them in a worse off position in terms of moving forward. Now, when that happens, I think we ask ourselves this question as parents: how do we deal with this? The first step in dealing with this is that we have to be educated. We have to be educated about some of the challenges that our children are facing. We have to confront the fact that some of our children have emotional disorders, behavioral disorders, and you name some other challenges. The question is, what do you do, and how do you confront these challenges? We cannot confront these challenges by using the same techniques and methods that were handed down to us when we were kids. Because what's happening is this: we're forcing our children into a more abusive culture where they may serve to harm themselves and harm others. And then we end up having children who become abusive parents, abusive spouse, and our entire culture and nations are impacted because of our failings as parents to address the challenges that they're facing, or inadequacies in terms of accepting the fact that they have certain challenges that need professional support. And professional support means that it may not be a spanking or a consequence, but they may need to see a counselor who could also counsel you as a parent and counsel the child, so that they could get the coping strategies that are needed to give them the footing and the latitude to effectively function and move away from some of the challenges that they're facing. Now, the question that I'm always asked when I do sessions like this: how do you figure out these things? Now, for every child, they have what is called triggers, and they have antecedent factors. So there's certain things that trigger certain behaviors, whether it be a child might have been abused. And you know that in our Caribbean culture, we are very, very much secretive when it comes on to abuse. And we almost cast people out who have gone through any levels of abuse. And then what happens, we bury those feelings and emotions, and we know what happens. Hurt people hurt people. And then we ask, why is it that this child is behaving the way they're behaving? They're behaving this way because they have been abused, they've been neglected, and they have not received the support that they need in order for them to handle and confront the challenges that they're facing in their infantile mind. And guess what happens? At some point, when these behaviors are unchecked, when they fail to get the support, then they respond in a negative way, not always because they want to be negative, but because they are without the coping strategies that would afford them the latitude to confront these things and operate in a safe way. So when you hear about counseling, when you hear about behavioral support or mobile therapists or behavioral specialists, these are some professionals that are needed to allow our children to be placed on the right path of addressing their behaviors and self-governing in some efforts in terms of doing what they should do so they could fit in society. I think it was Dr. Morgan and Heinz who said it, and even Ms. Heron even made mention of the fact that this has to be a community effort in providing the support that is needed. No longer can we hide ourselves thinking that we're safe and secure. No, we're not. Even though we have strong cultures in our Caribbean communities, there are a number of things that we have inherited from our slavery past that has served to perpetuate abuse and discord in the home. For example, look at it this way. If you're a father and you have spent little or no time in the home setting, now you're in the home because you have been displaced from your job, or you're in the home because there's an economic downturn, and you're trying to be a father overnight when you have not been practicing to be a father for the last 10 years. Now, what's going to happen? There's going to be confrontation between yourself and your children because they're not accustomed to daddy telling them what to do. No, mommy is not accustomed to you telling mommy or daddy what to do. So what's going to happen? You're going to have friction because your children are not accustomed to you taking authority. Your wife is not accustomed to you being a husband, and the household is now in mayhem. And the person who normally gets the blunt of everything is the person who is the weakest in the setting. And the weakest person here is the kids. So the kids now are viewed as the bad thing in the home, and they're the ones who get the blunt of just about everything. And then when you abuse that child responds in a negative way, and they find coping measures of their own. It may be sex, it may be drugs, it may be music. You name the different coping things that they may find, because anything that gives them that ease or that or give them something that counteracts the pain that they're feeling in the home, they will do it, because the infantile mind is always searching for a means of escape or something of pleasure or something that would help them to take their mind from the present abuse that they're feeling. Now, the question that you may ask me now, you may say, Jamie, how do you deal with this? As was said by, I think it was Heinz who said it, who said that we need to re-engineer the way we view home. We need to re-engineer the way we view fathering and mothering. We need to re-engineer how we set up our home structure. We need to re-engineer how we engage in conversation with our children, allowing them a safe place to state their challenges and allowing them a safe place to say when they're harmed, allowing them a safe place to share exactly that they need help, as opposed to giving them the idea that you are well, and if you make mention that you have any challenges, something is wrong with our system, and you're now blaming us as parents. So what happens is that our children now retreat and they surrender to themselves. Instead of sharing their challenges, they hold it to themselves and they find negative ways of manifesting the hurt and the pain that they're feeling. Now, separate and apart from that, we have children who have certain emotional and behavioral disorders that need help. It means that they cannot help the way that they're responding to the challenges that they're facing because they're at odds because of their overall makeup. And these dysfunctionality or these gaps or these special needs that they have, they need professional help. And a good beating or spanking will not take them from that position, but you're actually abusing them when you fail to deal with the disadvantages that they face because of the way they were born, the way they came into this world. But there are measures that could be taken to support them and give them the tools and the skill set to effectively function in society. So when we heard, when Tetu Heron talked about leadership in our society, it's a part of our government's responsibility to put measures in place that offers protective care for our children who have these learning challenges and these disabilities. And if they don't get this care, then they will be abused by society, by their families and by their friends and by the wider community. I know I've said a lot, but I'll say this. The question is, how do we deal with these areas? And the first thing is that we have to be aware We have to create safe and caring environment in our homes, in our schools, and in our communities. We have to create systems of compliance and reporting whereby when we have fathers and mothers and friends and relatives who seek to abuse or perpetuate violence in the home, that they're held accountable. And not only that they're held accountable, but we offer them training so that they could adequately go in their home setting and offer that safe, caring environment for the family. We also need to provide our children a safe space to share, a safe space to be themselves, a safe space to be vulnerable, a safe space to be catered for. We also need to seek professional support for our families and for our children in a home setting so that they may find the right avenue of not just sharing the pain that they're feeling, but also find the right way in articulating exactly when somebody would have treated them unfairly. And the last one is training and support is needed for the developing mind. We have to provide the training and support that is needed because when you look at it, in our Caribbean setting, many of our families are not aware, or even if they're aware, we end up finding ourselves just embodying and embracing sometimes the negative tenets of our culture that proves to be the very element that dismantles the family setting and provides for no healing for our families. In COVID-19 and in any pandemic, we now have to share spaces. And in sharing spaces, we have to become more aware of each other. And not everybody is willing to make that adjustment when that time happens. And a failure to make the adjustment means that you're going to have dominant forces in the home. And the group that is most vulnerable at this point is the weakest group. And the weakest group are the children. And because they are the most vulnerable group, they're the group that gets the end of the stick. And the end of the stick means that they're more prone for abuse, they're more prone for being mistreated, and they're more prone to be overlooked. My word to the community in the Caribbean community, in all the diasporas, is that we need to make an asserted effort in providing the support, the care, the nurturing, and we need to make it the new normal to admit and accept that we have children in our homes that have special need and who need support and who have disorders who need a different approach. And my final words are, we must be willing to adapt, adjust, and we must be willing to be agile as we take on leadership in the home so that we can protect the most vulnerable groups, which are our children. Thank you very much for having me. I know that it's a short stint, but that's just it in a nutshell in terms of handling and confronting at-risk tendencies in the home and accepting the fact that we all have at-risk tendencies, but that does not give any group the license to abuse or mistreat any groups because we are the most powerful in that setting. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much, Mr. Passenger. That was on my side. So if I interrupted you, excuse me. I believe that questions have already started coming in. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone still hear me? Can everyone hear me? Oof. Again, I apologize. We're experiencing a power cut right now. Therefore, I am relying on my data. I am now outside. There's a lot of rain. So again, please forgive me if my reception is terrible. I'm dealing with a power cut. What I was saying to Mr. Pottinger is thank you so very much. If I interrupted you earlier, I do apologize. You froze on my side. So I thought you were finished. Very, very good presentation. I think it overlaps with a lot of what the other presenters were speaking about. The fact that we need to be educated as parents, as adults, as leaders, as a community. We need to be educated. We need them, but also in the home. Parents need to release the shame and the stigma that is attached are having issues, real challenges with children who may have real mental or physical disabilities. We need to be able to really step outside of our egos and really seek the help to corporal punishment being something. And of course, the need for us to be present. We have to be consistent. We have to be present. We can't be sometime parents. We have to be there every step of the way, creating safe spaces for our children. Thank you again, Mr. Pottinger, and thank you to our presenters who have all touched on various aspects of domestic stress and offering different recommendations and practical tools to cope. We're now going to go to the question and answer segment. And I do believe that I've already gotten 2 questions. One for Mr. Pottinger, I'm going to throw it to you first, simply because you just came off. Someone said, in light of the fact that the Caribbean is general, we generally do not believe in therapy, there is stigma attached to it. How do we get parents to understand that a beating is not effective? Over to you.
Well, what I would say is that as having served as a behavioral specialist for quite many years, what I would say to parents is that if you want to really see transformation where your child is concerned, you have to first confront the fact that each child is unique and they're made differently. And because they're unique in terms of their strengths and their weaknesses, they may have unique challenges. And sometimes the unique challenges that they have are challenges that you as a parent, you're not equipped to deal with. You're not equipped to reform. You're not equipped to guide them along the right path. And with professional help, through data, through people who have gone there, you could use that information and get that professional therapy or counseling or guidance to help your child so that they could effectively function when the time is right for them to take on adulthood, and even while they're going through their growing pains based on their disabilities or the emotional disabilities that they're facing. So therapy is something that has worked. It continues to work. Counseling is something that continues to work. And just be reminded that if you don't have the professional expertise, seek the guidance of someone else who could guide the process in terms of you giving your child the best platform in being most successful.
Thank you so very much. And also, I think, and to add is that we also have to be a part of the community. A lot of the times we've been very quiet when we understand that children, especially those with disabilities, are the most vulnerable. And we are aware that they're being abused, and instead we become complicit. Take the stance as community members, as neighbors, and to also get involved where protecting our children are concerned. Dr. Morgan, I have a question for you, and the question is, you touched on the psychological, we touched on social. Someone is asking specifically about a particular type of person who can be considered that kind of stress caused by that type of person.
I didn't quite hear the question, Terry. Did you say narcissistic?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay,
yes,
so the question that the person had was, how do you deal with a narcissist? The type of stress that comes with narcissists. How do you cope with that type of person? Big question.
Yeah, that's a very complex question. The narcissistic personality is a very difficult personality to deal with. So often in terms of the therapeutic intervention, they're one of the least likely persons to come for intervention, right? So this then becomes about how you protect yourself as an individual. So if you're telling me that this person is a narcissist, you have some idea around what that might be, then you need to be able to know what lines, again, going back to what I said about prioritizing prioritizing on your demands and other people's priorities, and what you need to for yourself, your own self-care, because that's what it's going to come down to. If that person is not willing to seek help in terms of even the relationship or the family or whatever, then I think that you have to seek ways to take care of yourself.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Morgan. And it takes me back to what you presented earlier, which is sometimes you have to have exit strategies. Sometimes, as you rightfully said, especially if we're dealing with a narcissist, they never usually admit to being in the wrongdoing. They never usually admit to having, being the instigators, and they usually never go and get the help. So I think for the person who might have asked the question, if you have exhausted all, channels, it comes now down to where your priority lies. And quite frankly, sometimes you have to say no. Sometimes you have to give up this thing that is more toxic for you than ever. And going back to what Dr. Morgan, I think, mentioned in her presentation, is that exit strategies now become very, very important to take care of you. Sometimes that has to be the only way to get that care, and that is to get out. Dr. Morgan, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that you summed it up pretty well. I think it was Marsha that talked about exit strategies.
Marsha, correct.
But definitely, yes.
Correct. And we just want to remind our viewers, whether you are watching via Facebook or YouTube, please send your questions and your comments in, whether it is for the group in general, whether it is to a presenter in particular. We welcome your questions and your concerns. We realize quite a lot of the overlap has to do with culture, how we see ourselves, how we view our roles, and the respect that we have with other persons. So again, we encourage you to ask your questions. They're definitely sending me those questions. For the presenters, as you listened to each other present, was there anything that you thought we might have overlooked or that we did not speak about that we could take the opportunity to shine a light on?
Just very quickly, I wanted to make the point. You rightfully said that, children who have different abilities are susceptible, vulnerable, to stress and also to dysfunction when it shows up in the domestic space. I wanted to make the point, though, seeing as how we're shifting thoughts and concepts, or trying to shift thoughts and concepts today, that there is a type of child with special needs that we don't talk about a lot. And that's actually exceptional children who are also very sensitive, very perceptive, and who hurt a lot, often in silence, in certain family situations. So not only are we looking out for children who have what we call outward different ability, but we are also looking for those children who are, what we define as a genius in the real sense of the word, and the other children with other types of needs who also struggle a lot when there's domestic stress and or dysfunction.
Thank you so very much for that contribution. Do you think therefore there needs to be an expansion on the topic?
Well, I mean, yeah, we've just scratched the surface of many things today. Like I said, as much as we talk about the economy in the Caribbean, as much as we talk about tourism, if we are going to really claim a place in the world moving forward as a Caribbean nation, and a place that is free from what we used to be, to our colonial masters, if we are really going to step onto the world stage as the best Caribbean that we can be, then this type of discussion is the type of discussion that we need to have. Our culture is one of the biggest assets, that melting pot of language and food and carnival that we have, used to distinguish ourselves. But in a lot of ways, that culture also holds us in an unhealthy space in terms of our family units, and in terms of how we see care work, as Taitu articulated, how we see therapy, how we see self-care, how we even see spending money on these things. Because again, in the Caribbean, you buy a house, you buy a car, nobody tells you buy therapy if you need it. So I think to really claim ourselves as a people, and to claim our place among other people of the world, these definitely are the conversations we have to have moving forward.
Very well said. Thank you so very much. It's funny you should say that, because I heard someone, I believe in another webinar that I hosted, and it was said, with great jest that, when our hair doesn't look good, we get it fixed. When our nails need to be done, we get it done. When we think we're out of shape, we go to the gym. And yet still, when we speak of mental health or needing a therapy, all of a sudden it becomes not really, no thank you. So again, I see more conversations. I see more people being honest about needing the help. And so thank you for that contribution. And it's a perfect segue for a question to Mr. Pottinger. What coping mechanisms can parents who are themselves stressed and stretched financially use to positively deal with this current situation, especially those parents who are in denial of their abusive ways towards their children or other family members?
Well, that is a very complex question because of how complex our home settings are in the Caribbean, meaning that there are certain norms or behavioral patterns that are accepted to be normal, and there are certain actions that are actually celebrated in the Caribbean. The first move, though, is that parent has to have the willingness and the mindset to adjust and to be different, to make changes. And the reason I'm saying that is that sometimes in the Caribbean culture, if you're willing to change, then what happens is that you may find yourself being ostracized by the general community who find what you're doing to be different from what the norm is. The first thing I would say to that parent is that you cannot give what you don't have. And if you don't have it, it means that you need to seek it. Seeking it means that you have to first get help so you could give help. If you are messed up in the mind, and if you're lacking the skill set needed to offer the support and the culturing that your child or your family needs, it's best if you first seek counseling, because if you try to do something that you're not okay with, then you may create greater damage than what you would have not normally done. And we have seen that in many homes. We have seen a lot of families that have been destroyed because of the incorrect approach. And then, as I think it was Heron who made mention, that these things are what we see as a result in our overall economic status, because we have broken homes and we have families and parents who are lacking the skill set to effectively cater for the high functioning kids, the low functioning kids, those who have emotional and behavioral disorders. And because they're lacking that skill set, and because the stigma that says that if you seek counseling or if you seek help, it's now labeling, and that labeling now pushes them backwards in terms of getting the assistance that is needed. So the first thing is seek support, seek help from a professional who could guide you in the right path. After you'd have gotten help, then get your child identified based on what kind of support is needed in order for them to move forward from a therapeutic perspective and from a behavioral perspective, so you could exactly diagnose what the challenges are. So you're not prescribing something that your child do not need, because sometimes in a family setting, we give what is not needed and we create another problem by us trying to fix something with something that is not right for that. So that was what my advice would be for that family, that question.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much, Mr. Pottinger. We touched on domestic stress, practical tools to cope, human rights, psychology, behavior, women and development. We touched on quite a lot of topics. I'd just like to say thank you again to our presenters who really gave us insight, brought a lot of information to the table, and helped to enlighten us to go back and share with our family, friends, and community. Dr. Kai Morgan, Marsha Heinz, Title Heron, Jamie Pottinger, sincerest gratitude to you all. We'd like to also thank Judy from Go Blue Inc., David Foster, Patrick Johnson, Marcia Reed, Cherise Glasgow, and Cleveland Sam, all from the UA Open Campus, for really working together, putting the elements together and putting on this discussion. We apologize for any interruption that was caused due to the rain as well as the power cut. Again, this conversation will continue offline, and we hope that the continue will get even deeper and wider, and that we will see the necessary change we need, not just from a micro level, but a macro level. So again, I am Dr. Terry Carell Reed. It was a pleasure serving you as a moderator, and kindly continue to send your questions so that we can answer afterwards. Have a fantastic afternoon, and thank you again for your kind attention. Take care.
Thanks, guys. Bye.